Welcome to the Carsey Policy Hour, our monthly discussion series for people passionate about the issues and policies that are shaping New Hampshire communities. The topic this month is freeze, floods, and fire, extreme weather of 2023 and community solutions. Our guest is Mary Stampone. And my name is UC Terrell. In addition to the Carsey Policy Hour, I serve as Director of Training of our Center for Impact Finance. As folks are entering today, please type your name and organization in the chat so we know who's here today. As always, your questions and comments are welcome also in the chat. I'll include as many as I can in the discussion, and we'll also follow up with the recording and slides. Thanks as always to our partners at the state's Bureau of Education and Training. The BET's Certified Public Manager Program feeds into the Carsey School's master's programs in public administration, public policy, community development, and global affairs. We are also delighted to welcome a new partner, the New Hampshire Municipal Association. NHMA works to strengthen New Hampshire cities and towns and promotes effective municipal government through education, training, advocacy, and legal services. As I mentioned, our speaker today is Mary Stampone. Dr. Stampone is an associate professor of geography at UNH, where she researches climate system monitoring and applied climate science with a focus on regional climate variability and change. She's also the New Hampshire state climatologist. In this role, she provides New Hampshire citizens, educators, and agencies with weather and climate information in support of environmental management and planning activities, as she is doing with us today. Mary is a repeat guest on the Carsey Policy Hour, last joining us with Cameron Wake in October 2020. Mary, I can think of no better trailer for this discussion than last Thursday's nor'easter that left 230,000 customers in the state without power, closed schools and businesses. Less dramatic, also newsworthy, is the recent New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services release of the draft 2024 Priority Climate Action Plan. I know you'll be speaking to both of these and putting them in the context of community action and what we as a state at all levels can do to build climate resilience across our state.
Okay, great. Well, thank you all and good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. And so what I wanted to do to kind of start off with this morning is kind of, thinking about what seems to be kind of one record-breaking severe weather event after another. I want to kind of take a quick look back at the wild weather we had last year. It's kind of hard to think about 2023 given what we've already been through in 2024, but 2023 was pretty wild and impactful. And so what I want to do is connect those extremes and the extremes that we're seeing now to climate change. And then after that, I don't want to kind of just leave it with kind of the sort of negative aspects of all of this. I want to take some time then to kind of highlight some of the activities that are happening across the state that are being done at a variety of levels to address climate change and to make our communities more resilient to the impacts of climate change. And so these are not, I'm not a policy person, so I'll just put that out there to start with. But these are policies that some of the work that I do is intended to kind of inform, so that it's not just doing the climate research to put all that out there. It's intended to support local action to build resilience to climate change. So first, I just kind of want to start with the weather here. So of course, we're all familiar with New Hampshire's variable climate. It's characterized by, of course, 4 distinct seasons, which are becoming less distinct, unfortunately. But this distinct seasonality, of course, supports this really diverse natural landscape that is both adapted to the extremes of cold and snowy winters, as well as warm to hot and humid summers. And of course, at daily scales, our weather is highly variable and capable, always has been capable of producing severe conditions, including, extremes in both warm and cold temperature, as well as precipitation, resulting in, floods, as well as droughts. And of course, we can have floods while we're in a drought. And so a lot of this has to do with the fact that we are located below the confluence of several major North American storm tracks. And so the passing of these cyclones, like the one you're seeing in the satellite image here, this is actually that cyclone that passed last Thursday that brought us snow and all the power outages. So storms like these are really responsible for the highly variable temperature and precipitation patterns that include, blizzards, thunderstorms, and even the occasional hurricane. So to kind of take us back a little bit further to 2023, of course, 2023 was no exception to the highly variable weather. And we saw a number of record extreme events, particularly with respect to temperature extremes, hot and cold, as well as heavy precipitation. So if you recall, we kind of, a lot like this year, not as extreme, but like this year, we kind of started January 2023, at least across southern parts of the states, with very little snow. And we kind of had our first big impactful winter storm then a couple weeks into January. And if you remember that snow we had, or that storm we had heavy wet snow. We had nearly about 40,000 power outages across the state. This was also, I know, memorable for me because I lost power on the first day of the spring semester, which was a bit inconvenient there. So we kind of started out with a bang with that. And then a few weeks later, we had that Arctic outbreak in early February that was kind of extreme on the cold end, resulting in wind chills that were, negative or double-digit negative temperatures below zero in Fahrenheit scale. So that was a substantial winter cold that was really on the extreme end historically. This was then followed by kind of our first nor'easter of the season, which happened in mid-March. This was another heavy, wet snow event, resulting in up to 2 feet of snow across parts of New Hampshire, resulting in even more power outages and school closures across the state. And then kind of flipping to the exact opposite side of things, about a month later, we had an extreme heat event in April where for 2 days we saw temperatures across southern parts of the state reach 90 Fahrenheit. And so having this rapid warming happening in April caused kind of an early bud burst for a lot of our trees as well as agricultural plants, which then unfortunately was followed just merely a month later by a now switch to a record-breaking hard freeze. There are parts of North Country that where overnight temperatures dropped down to as low as 18 Fahrenheit during this event. And having already had a lot of our plants out and doing their thing, we ended up with really a devastating freeze event here, a record-breaking event. Just for kind of reference here, some of the farms and orchards across the state lost nearly 50 to almost 100% of their fruit crops, including apples and grapes, which were particularly impacted, resulting in millions of dollars in damages statewide. And this was on top of the agricultural losses stemming from that February cold air outbreak, which impacted the peach crops prior to this May hard freeze that impacted apples.
Mary, I'm going to break for 1 minute because we have a question from Michelle that I think is so relevant to
Oh, yeah.
understand this slide. Isn't the February 3rd and 4th cold snap normal for New Hampshire? So, if you see these Arctic outbreak in February, is that really that extreme?
They are, or they used to be more normal. They're becoming less frequent, but this one was actually even extreme for New Hampshire normal, and really extreme considering the warming that we've been experiencing in our winter seasons over the past 50 years or so.
Thanks.
So that is a great question. So this was actually even extreme for our cold extremes. So the start of the year was pretty wild. And then we move on into summer. And so the summer was a really good example of how kind of our weather is connected to weather across the North American continent. So over the summer, we had this high pressure ridge just kind of set in over the central and western US. And so that kind of dried things out there. created what we call a heat dome. So they had extreme temperatures or extreme heat there. But what that did for us is it pushed that jet stream, which is where the storm track is, kind of over the northern plains, causing it to kind of swoop down over the Great Lakes and New England. And it kind of stayed put for most of the summer. And what that did is kind of funnel both the so the smoke from the northwestern Canadian wildfires, so all the way up there, that smoke was just being funneled with the jet stream over the Great Lakes in New England, reducing air quality throughout most of the summer months here in New England. And being the storm track, it also funneled a lot of those big storm systems over New England as well. So we just had one heavy rain event over or after another throughout June and July, kind of peaking it with that July 9th and 10th massive flood event where we had several inches of rain on top of previous storms that also produced several inches of rain with antecedent moisture conditions already high. Soils were soaked. We had some major flooding occur across western parts of the state and up in through Vermont. So we had this major flood event there in July. And then moving into August, things did kind of calm down a little bit, but we still had, again, some heavy rain events, including an August 8th event that resulted in flooding for central parts of the state. It also created some severe weather, including tornadoes that impacted Massachusetts to our south. So one of the things to note too during the summer, the one extreme that we didn't have was heat. We didn't have a lot of 90 Fahrenheit days across the summer. And part of that was because of the kind of the cloud cover kind of kept us a little cooler. And this kind of, reduced the extreme heat up until September. And then finally in September, we ended up with a major heat wave that of course coincided with the start of the school year. And so this sort of late season heat wave resulted in, cancellations of a lot of outdoor athletics, as well as some school curtailments due to unsafe indoor air temperatures, as well as the outdoor temperatures. Beyond that, fall was comparatively quiet. We did have a hurricane. So Hurricane Lee impacted New England and the the Canadian Maritimes as a post-tropical storm. Fortunately for us, we didn't see as much of the impact. We were kind of on that upper left quadrant. But this is a good example of how, some of those warming temperatures of the northern oceans are making it or are more conducive to tropical systems kind of maintaining their strength longer as they move up into the northern waters of the North Atlantic. And so kind of to end here, the start of this winter season, which has been so impactful, of course, it started with a strong storm system. And so up in the mountains, so we didn't have a lot of snow or any snow actually down here in southern New Hampshire, but the mountains had quite a bit of snow from an earlier sort of late fall snowstorm. And this particular storm had really strong, inflow of warm air ahead of it. And so that warm air ahead of the snow caused like kind of a flash snow melt event across the mountains. And then as the storm passed, it brought several inches of rain, resulting in widespread flooding across the mountains, which washed out roads and bridges with some extreme impacts there on the ski resorts that were just getting ready to kind of welcome winter vacation visitors. And so these are, just kind of some examples of the extremes that we saw, and the extreme nature of these weather events is directly related to climate change, since climate change and the additional energy in the atmosphere kind of really gives these storms, the energy to be more extreme, stronger winds, more precipitation, hotter hots, higher highs, drier dry conditions associated with climate change. So to kind of bring this into perspective with climate change here, so this graph then shows global warming since the mid-20th century as the distribution of annual average land surface temperatures, or the difference from the average to the observed. And these are, again, collected from around the world, show how global average temperature increased in response to increases in human source greenhouse gases in the atmosphere since the mid-20th century. And so putting this into motion, we can see that as global temperature increases over time, the value and frequency of warm temperatures also increase. So when we average this over decades, the new, sort of climate normal and range of temperatures is warmer. It is warmer. And so the shift in the normal range toward higher temperature values makes abnormally warm weather, including extremes, more likely to occur now than in the past. But also, while we're going to get overall warmer with more warm extremes, the cold season, and of course the cold season is also becoming milder, but still cold extremes like February's Arctic outbreak and that late spring hard freeze will still continue to occur. And so when people try to compare, what our future climate is going to be like by saying, and by 2050, we'll be more like New Jersey, or by the end of the century under our high emissions will be more like the Carolinas. Those kind of comparisons aren't really appropriate, because although we're getting warmer and our cold season is getting milder, we're still far enough north to get these cold extremes. And I think the weather of 2023 really clearly demonstrated the fact that even in a warmer world, we can still have some of these cold events that are going to kind of make adaptation more challenging, especially for agricultural sectors in the years ahead. And so speaking of general warming, New England is already warming faster than the rest of the US. And a lot of this is due to an increased warming rate during our winter season. So winters are warming 3 times faster than summer, and we're kind of seeing a decrease in these differences between our seasons, and a sort of kind of flattening out of our seasonality a bit. And so statistically, our annual temperatures statewide have already warmed by about 3 degrees Fahrenheit since records began in 1895. And of course, the energy sort of represented by this warming has led to an increase in total annual precipitation of about 8 inches. And this increase is largely due to an increase in the frequency and intensity of extreme precipitation events. And so here we're seeing more precipitation happening in these heavy individual events as opposed to being spread out. And so with more rain coming in larger events, we're seeing a reduction in light rain events in between, and longer dry periods between heavy rain events, which during the warm season leaves us more vulnerable to drought. And then, of course, beyond how much precipitation we're getting, we're also seeing a change in precipitation type during winter, with an increase in the proportion of precipitation falling as rain due to the milder cold season temperatures, as well as more frequent mid-season thaw events. And so, of course, these changes across the region will continue to impact our economy as well as our infrastructure and the health of the ecosystems that support our communities statewide. And so if we think about, New Hampshire, where, we are so greatly affected by the weather here, changing weather patterns are, of course, posing new challenges across the states. But even with this, climate change can still kind of seem somewhat abstract and potentially far off, considering the variability in weather, we already, have experienced for decades. And so, kind of thinking about changes in climate compared to our everyday weather, it can be hard to think about, that connection between climate and weather. But of course, given the extremes that we've experienced, it really isn't surprising that most New Hampshire residents are concerned about global warming and think global warming is affecting our weather. So a lot of folks are now making that tie or making that connection between these extreme weather events and climate change. But even here, where we're so, greatly affected by the weather between power outages, economics that are relying on sort of weather dependent activities, still fewer than half of New Hampshire residents in this more recent Yale climate opinion poll think that, they themselves will experience the consequences. So they think there's a connection there that global or climate change is influencing the weather, but few don't think that they'll be negatively harmed by it. But of course, the consequences of unchecked global warming, particularly the increasingly erratic and extreme weather of a warmer climate, are already here, are already disrupting lives and livelihoods throughout the states. And so I just want to take a couple of minutes here to just kind of point out the extremes that we are really concerned about here in New Hampshire, and that are related to changing climate. And of course, that is the increased risk from precipitation, heat, and flooding. And here we're particularly vulnerable to severe weather events like heavy precipitation and extreme temperatures, because a lot of our economy is dependent on weather, and much of our infrastructure, transportation systems, power supply, they weren't designed for the patterns that we're seeing even today, let alone what are projected for the future. And so here seeing with precipitation, again, a lot of this is largely due to an increase in heavy precipitation events. And these increases are expected to occur primarily during the winter and spring seasons. And so you add heavy precipitation, potentially more rain than snow on top of snow melt, leads a situation that makes us more vulnerable to flooding. Now, in the summer season, these extreme precipitation events aren't necessarily distributed throughout the year. And so the increased warming during summer without a change in precipitation leads us more susceptible to drier soils and more vulnerable to drought and potentially wildfires. There's a lot of uncertainty still with the risk for fire, but our changes in the summer may leave us more vulnerable. And then, of course, the heat is something that we're concerned about during the summer seasons. And at a minimum, by 2050, we can expect a doubling of the number of days above 90. And of course, geographically, heat extremes, tend to be greatest in urban areas, but rural residents without air conditioning are at risk on the hottest days as well as the hottest nights. And so while we can't necessarily eliminate all of these risks, these are risks that are kind of baked into what we've already contributed to by mid-century. We can reduce the risks post or for the latter half of the 21st century with a combination of not just adaptation, but mitigation. And so this is an image from the state climate assessment where we project mean annual maximum temperatures through the end of the century. And so the blue line shows you what we can expect kind of with the climate policy, the mitigation policies that are in place. So we're already committed to a certain amount of warming. And then by the end of the century, some continued warming, but generally a leveling off of warming as greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere stabilize in response to reduction in emissions. And then compare this to, this is that higher emissions scenario, this kind of business as usual. So kind of the worst case scenario, assuming we don't reduce, we can kind of see again how that the increase then in greenhouse gas emissions will result in much more change that we would have to adapt to compared to what we would expect if we also not only adapt, but also invest in mitigation activities. And so before I kind of show you some examples of some of these activities that are going on across the state, I just kind of want to reinforce here the differences between an adaptation approach versus a mitigation approach, where adaptation seeks to manage the risks of climate change impacts, compared to mitigation, which kind of addresses the cause of those impacts in the first place by reducing emissions to limit the amount of change that we'll have to adapt to. And then kind of focusing on really addressing this is this idea of resilience, which is the ability to prepare for and respond to climate change impacts, and combines both adaptation and mitigation measures that really increase our ability to not only mitigate the impacts, but but really kind of start to thrive. And so it includes more than just kind of preparing for hazards, reducing emissions, but also building up communities so that they have more of a capacity to handle some of the negative impacts posed by particularly weather hazards associated with a changing climate. And so given that, we are already experiencing the impacts of climate change, and we can expect to continue to be experiencing these at least through through mid-century over the next couple of decades, there is action to both adapt to and mitigate climate change occurring at all levels of the state. And so if you ever kind of start to get a little overwhelmed by all of the changes that we can expect, I encourage you to kind of look at what's happening across the state here. There's some really amazing things going on, and kind of thinking about state agencies who are kind of coordinating a lot of this work at the state level. It's not just, all up to the state to do this. The state is working with any number of partners, which of course includes so the New Hampshire Coastal Adaptation Work Group. I'm sure plenty of folks here are familiar with their work. And what they work on is to, build resilience to the impacts of extreme weather and long-term change within coastal watershed communities. Further north, so in the Upper Valley area, the Upper Valley Adaptation Work Group works through vital communities with projects focused on reducing reliance on fossil fuels for heating, electricity, and transportation. The New Hampshire Association of Regional Planning Communities is the affiliation of our 9 regional planning communities, or commissions that are there to assist communities in, among other things, preparing for hazard mitigation plans, and helping to secure funding for infrastructure projects, which of course play an essential role in what has been kind of an ongoing statewide effort to improve our stormwater and transportation infrastructure to mitigate flood hazards. And then the New Hampshire Coastal Risk and Hazards Commission is established by bipartisan legislation, and it is focused again on preparing for projected sea level rise, as well as other coastal watershed hazards associated with storms, increased river flooding, storm runoff, and coastal erosion. And so with these different groups, you can see there's kind of a different focus, which kind of illustrates how, each area there's, place-based efforts to work with what they have and address the hazards that are happening, in communities at community level, where we can really be efficient with the type of projects that are being invested in. And then, so at the town level, so in municipalities, there are a lot of towns themselves are developing climate action plans. This includes Hampton. So Hampton is focusing on sea level rise and coastal flooding. And so they received funds from the Piscataqua Region Estuaries Partnership to gonna audit land use regulations and to integrate the coastal flood risk guidance that came out of the New Hampshire Coastal Risk and Hazards Commission. So Hampton wants to try to integrate that state level recommendation into their town planning to address sea level rise. Portsmouth has kind of been ahead of the game. So for, almost 2 decades, they've been an eco municipality. And right now, they are working on Portsmouth's Climate Future Project, which involves developing a climate action plan that will kind of identify and phase targeted greenhouse gas emission reductions at the municipal and community levels, as well as identify adaptation measures that will increase resiliency throughout the city. They're also working with SolSmart and trying to improve solar markets as part of this. And then another good example here is Nashua. Their project is ongoing, and and they're working to kind of define short-term actions that the city can take to address the challenges of climate change in an equitable way. So they're also including equity into their plans. And then kind of at the even more of a local scale, residents, nonprofits, and private organizations are working, in communities, and again, they're essential to implementing some of these regional, state, and town level initiatives. And so, for example, we have the Great Bay Living Shoreline projects that focuses on nature-based solutions within the Great Bay Estuary to protect communities from erosion, sea level rise, and flooding. I just kind of wanted to bring up last month's Carsey Policy Hour talk, which featured community solar program and the collaboration with Revision Energy and New Hampshire resident-owned communities to invest in solar power for manufactured housing communities. And then Flood Ready Neighborhood is a project out of UNH that brings residents, so individual residents together to increase resilience to flooding and erosion at the neighborhood level. So these are by no means exhaustive list of things that are happening across the state, but just, kind of a really good example of some of the under the radar projects that are happening statewide at, kind of all levels, from individual to the town up to the state level. And I want to end today then with kind of the most recent and exciting kind of advance here in our state's sort of actions at resilience is the update to the 2009 Climate Action Plan. And so we in New England, we have kind of the oldest climate action plan of all of the 6 New England states. And so we to date have kind of been at the state level, falling a little bit behind our neighbors. But with EPA funding from the Climate Pollution Reduction Grant that was provided through the Inflation Reduction Act, New Hampshire has started the process of updating the Climate Action Plan, starting with the priority plan with the goal to, and I quote, create a pathway that will support investment in policies, practices, and technologies that reduce pollutant emissions, so the mitigation, while also creating high quality jobs, spurring economic growth, and enhanced quality of life. And so the report was developed with extensive community and stakeholder feedback, of course, in coordination with the Carsey's New Hampshire Listens. And the priority climate action plan was released last month, which lists the following as priority measures that could reduce the state's greenhouse gas emissions while benefiting low-income disadvantaged communities in the state. And so we're looking at, again, creating good jobs and lowering costs for families, accelerating work to reduce environmental impacts, specifically with low income and overburdened communities, and to deliver cleaner air by reducing harmful pollutions. And so it's worth noting that the state has already reduced greenhouse gas emissions since they peaked in 2005. But what this plan does is really kind of focus in on kind of some of the big pieces here, identifying transportation, which is our largest source of greenhouse gas emissions, and the only sector that's actually seen an increase in emissions since 2005, along with residential building, local government, waste management, really as focus areas for mitigation planning. And so this report, which is available now, I encourage you to check it out. This will be followed later in the summer by the comprehensive climate action plan that is currently in development and will then replace the 2009 climate action plan. And so there's a lot here to discuss. And so I will stop there. I do have a list of references if anybody is interested in more information. And I will, I'll stop and open it up to everyone else. Thank you.
Mary, that was tremendous. Thank you so much. I was particularly struck by your observation that our region has higher than average climate change, but lower than average sentiment that climate change and the related extreme weather events will affect me, and just the disconnect sometimes between perception and reality. And Mary, you can come back on screen or have go to any slides that come up as part of our conversation. But for everyone, the slides will be available, including those references online, as will this recording. So it's your observation about the gap between perception and reality is very connected to one of our recent Carsey briefs, authored by Madeline Smith, a candidate in our Natural Resources and Earth System Science PhD program here at UNH. And we'll be able to get Maddie to answer a few questions later on today. But the brief of From a Shorter Winter Season to More Storm Damage, New Hampshire outdoor recreation providers feel climate impacts far more than visitors. And this was also represented in the Boston Globe article by Amanda Goki, who is also in this call. It's just interesting, the difference between what our businesses and communities may be feeling, what visitors see from the outside. And I wonder if you could speak more to sometimes where the biggest where the disconnect between reality and perception has the most impact in planning and strategizing for building further resilience.
Well, part of it, I think we're pretty hardy. We've been dealing with a lot of extreme weather, so I think we're already kind of accustomed to that. And we're sort of stuck saying, well, wow, this is kind of really extreme, but I mean, we can manage power outages and we're a little more resilient, as they say, to these events than maybe other regions are. Also, it is worth noting that there are socioeconomic disparities in terms of the impacts, and so some of the people, might, again, individually or within their community, be more resilient to these than other folks. There's a lot of different, parts or little small factors that can influence how well you are, whether you have, maybe family to stay with during an evacuation. Some people do, some people don't. That'll impact, how resilient you are and maybe how you feel, how, at risk you or vulnerable you feel to different events, whether or not you have air conditioning, how much heat, where do you work? Do you work outdoors during the summer? All of these kind of really, personal impacts will influence how, vulnerable you feel. And so I think that there's a lot of kind of socioeconomic and little micro factors that are at play here.
Right. It's not affecting me. It's not affecting anyone I know. And if we think about legislators or those who are in a decision-making position, is the voice of those who are being most affected making their way into those conversations and into those decisions? Yeah. We have Jane Wellman, Director of Operations of the City of Reading in Massachusetts, talking about it. I mean, her municipality, they've done some resilience with constructed stormwater wetland, and she dropped a link in the chat. And Matt Kahalane, if I am saying that correctly, a public health advisor, longtime veteran at DHHS, also notes that with the increase in extreme events, there's some good news that the population has adapted well, and injuries and deaths have mostly decreased over the past 5 decades. And then building resilient building interventions will be important to maintain these public health improvements. It does seem that across various divisions and arms of government, there's more of an awareness here.
Yeah, and our towns have been really effective in addressing concerns within communities. And again, part of that kind of New England, town structure really does lend itself well toward community engagement and resilience building at those smaller levels.
Right. And, we all have a part to play in combating climate change. And I think of the Russian dolls or the nested systems of individuals and households, communities, state and federal government, and everyone needs to play their part. But sometimes particular interventions are more effective at a particular level in this system than others. We've talked a lot about what the communities are doing, and you shared the work with the climate action plan. How would you describe, or how would you guide a society towards what decisions are best made at a community level, which are best made at a state or federal level, so that the right amount of feasibility and incentive and adoption and also local control and independence are reflected?
So obviously, funding is going to, play a major role in what can be done. And I really encourage, and I think a lot of places are doing this, is just to look for, of course, efficiencies and doubling up. And so this is where if you looked at the fifth national climate assessment that just came out in December of last year, the Northeast chapter really did a good job of highlighting the nature-based solutions where you get the biggest bang for your buck is doing what nature has always done. And so kind of doubling up on projects that can kind of hit at as many aspects of resilience as possible. And so I highlighted the Living Shoreline project as a good example, because seagrass and salt marshes, they absorb a lot of floodwater. So they're a great adaptation and flood mitigation effort. But those ecosystems also store a lot of carbon. And so, they're a better option than putting up, seawalls and other hard engineering projects that might prevent some erosions over the next couple of decades, but aren't necessarily a long-term solution. And so, yeah, focusing on those, and also, again, place-based solutions. What do I need? I'm not going to worry about what somebody else needs. What do we need? What is the best solution for us? There's not one size fits all. It's going to be a lot of smaller projects that can add up to big change.
We have a couple questions in the chat as well. Matt asks, what specific research projects are you working on this year to better understand weather and climate impacts in New Hampshire? And asks for journal publications that that we should look forward to reading, or I would add to that other recommended reading that you might suggest to our audience.
So the project that we're working on now is our NOAA funded project that's looking at building resilience within the manufactured housing communities. And so we're focused mostly on flooding there. And we actually got delayed a bit because some of the communities that we were working with on flood resilience were flooded in that July 9th and 10th storm. So some of those communities are still still impacted by those events. And so that's been a lot of the focus. We're working on kind of two prongs of that, just kind of identifying what communities here in New Hampshire are at greatest risk. So that's sort of the mapping part of the project, but then also meeting with communities on ways that works for them, community-focused solutions to flood risk. And so we hope to have that project all wrapped up by the summer and a paper going in for publication probably by fall. Another kind of publication that I'm working on is a kind of an offshoot of the climate assessment that Cameron Wig and Liz Burkowski and I put out a couple of years ago now, where I'm working with a couple of other state climatologists and putting together a peer review publication to go in along with some of the national climate assessment literature on sort of what are the best approaches to developing state level and as well as local level climate assessments that then support the development of these climate action plans at local and state levels.
You. Yulia asks, what are the programs for restoring natural areas like forest and water cycles with allowing beavers to do their work in creating water retention areas that dampen effects of floods and droughts?
So I'm more familiar with some of those projects happening out west and in more drought prone areas. I'm not familiar with some of that activity happening here. But yeah, beavers are fantastic. I mean, again, nature-based solutions. But I know the Nature Conservancy in the region is a really big regional partner in a lot of the conservation programs that are happening in terms of kind of conservation efforts that they're doing themselves, as well as funding local conservation projects. And so I encourage you to look up some of the resources the Nature Conservancy has. I didn't highlight them because they have so much that they're going on, but they are a big regional player in conservation with both with resiliency in mind.
Emily has asked about the presentation available to share. Yes, it will be posted in entirety, as will the slides. And we'll have to do it in PowerPoint format instead of PDF, Mary, because of your fabulous animations.
I love the NASA stuff, but yeah, I can't make that a PDF.
And your points about the equitable transition, I'm so glad to hear that Nashua has made that a cornerstone of their plan. We do a lot with that at the Center for Impact Finance, where we look at capital moments to whenever there's a loan or investment, how do we insert resilience practices into any loan and making sure or other investment within infrastructure or within communities more generally. So I would encourage folks to check out our work there. And in particular, we've done a lot of work in solar development in low income and historically disadvantaged communities. I want to turn to Maddie, who I see is online, the author of the brief that I mentioned earlier. And Maddie, you mentioned you had some recommendations for I'm just pulling it up, for the statewide comprehensive outdoor recreation plan. And your climate-related recommendations talked about the importance of adaptation, stewardship, and collaboration. And could you briefly elaborate on those and how it connects to what Mary has presented today?
Sure, thanks. Can you hear me okay? Yes. Headphones in. Okay, great. Yeah, thanks for having me. And Mary, thank you so much for that wonderful presentation and all the work that you've done, because I looked at it quite a bit when working on the SCORP and looking at our climate questions. Yeah, and as UC started to talk about, there were 3 climate adaptation main action items that were included in the most recent SCORP, which is done every 5 years. And they focus on the design and redesign of recreation areas, stewardship and educational programs to engage visitors in just being more aware, and interagency collaboration. And that last one, part of that last action step is really focusing on response to extreme weather event damage and trying to come up with systems such as like an emergency recovery fund for recreation areas who are faced with the increasing number of damages to their areas and trying to figure out how to deal with that.
Mary, does that relate to your work, or do you have any questions for Maddie?
Oh, no, it definitely relates. And yeah, I saw the brief. I thought that was fantastic. And that's just an example of, again, like, how a lot of this work, making climate science accessible and applicable is really essential to, kind of meeting the resilience needs of communities, not just across New Hampshire, but, across the US.
And businesses operating in an increasingly erratic weather situation, right? Where the snowfall on Thursday allowed for skiing, but many ski resorts had already planned to close that weekend or had even closed already.
Yeah, we had our biggest snowfall here of the season in April.
Right. Jack Gale brings up, so we've talked about nature-based solutions. He points out that the recent damage to the $600,000 sand wall in Salisbury shows the futility of some actions. Can we teach from this?
Yes. And these discussions are happening, all along, kind of the Atlantic and Gulf Coast about how, do we try to protect coastal communities from sea level rise, and noting that, of course, sea level, even if we do kind of stabilize atmospheric greenhouse gas concentrations and kind of stabilize the climate and have our new normal that we can adapt to and work within, sea levels are still going to continue to increase. And there's just going to be a point, when, you can only adapt to so much, or the amount of the investment you need to invest into, adaptation is just unsustainable. And so there are going to still be some tough decisions that coastal communities are going to have to face. And again, it's worth keeping in mind equity in those discussions moving forward. There is just, when it comes to the sea level rise, there just are going to be some things where adaptation might not be the most effective approach.
Michelle notes it is concerning that a lot of adaptation solutions fall to rivers, namely dams for reservoirs and hydro, and withdrawals for snowmaking and other purposes.
Right. And so, and I didn't touch on this, but some of the priority plan talks about, there's maladaptation too. And so those are the adaptation measures that are going to, help us manage the risks now, but could increase risks later on. And so heat is a decent example of that, where, one way to, help with heat in the near term is, of course, investing in more indoor air conditioning. But depending on how you power that air conditioning, that puts increased stress on already stressed power infrastructure in the heat. And at the time, then, if you're powering it using fossil fuels, you're contributing to the problem. And so, if at all possible, think about the future impacts of any kind of adaptation measure, and whether or not it's potentially maladaptation. So, like, yeah, drawing water from reservoirs for snowmaking, and then we have a drought in the summer. Those things need to be balanced.
Right. And decision-making in so many different places, it's the unanticipated consequences of these.
Yeah, which is why, again, kind of more upper level leadership is still necessary. There's a lot of work happening at local levels, but there does need to be some coordination, so one community isn't kind of adapting at the expense of another community.
Yeah, so my question, I guess, is what should be included in the next SCORP? So it's done every 5 years. This is the first time that climate impacts or climate conditions were measured in the stakeholder engagement surveys. So there's one that goes out to residents, and there's another one that goes out to providers. And in this past one, we asked about extreme weather events, water and wildlife, forests, summer conditions and winter conditions. Is there anything that we're missing or that we should be thinking about as we move forward?
You know, I tend to think of, kind of our climate here in New Hampshire as a natural resource.
Mhm.
And the value of snow, the value of water, the value of our natural ecosystems is really important. And we're going to have to accept that some of our ecosystems are going to change in response to the changes. That doesn't have to be all bad. And so kind of thinking about, again, where change can be good, is kind of an important part of this. And I have to read a little bit more of that, but with the outdoor recreation, again, it's one of those weather and climate dependent industries that is so critical to our economy. And so finding ways to appropriately diversify is another approach, to kind of find the benefits, along with potential risks that are coming with climate change.
The brief identifies outdoor recreation sector as the canary in the coal mine, right? As perhaps the tip of the spear, perhaps it's mixing analogies, but a sector that will feel the brunt earlier and more so than others, but perhaps foreshadows impacts to come.
Yeah, and Larry Hamilton, Kurt Grimm, and I actually had a paper back in 2018 that kind of looked at perceptions of climate change in North Country, and they were already kind of reporting, feeling the impact of climate change, given the impact on their, winter tourism industry that was, kind of frontline for climate change impacts, at the time, and still is.
We have a comment. So Mary, we're almost at time. I'll leave you to have the final word, including perhaps recommendations at the state level and at community levels for how we can continue with the positive adaptation and resilience building that we need to do. Peter Burdett has noted that snowmaking stores the water on slopes until spring and then returns it, less evaporation. So it's not like all of that water is out of the system.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And again, those kinds, the snowmaking is going to be essential to that industry, and finding, better ways to do it is going to be really important. And they're doing it. Again, more work is being done than we even know about.
Well, Mary, bring us home. What would your final comments be on how we can move forward together?
So I think just again, noting that we can address this. We have the technology, we have the tools to address climate change. It's a big problem. It can be overwhelming, but again, really focus on what we can do, and this is something we all need to work on. And so be involved, and yeah, just keep working at it, and we can and get there, and we need to.
Thank you for bringing your science also to the conversations at the state level. It's a great example of UNH engagement, and we're just so grateful for you sharing with us today. For folks on the call, we have two great Carsey Policy Hours coming up in May and in April. In May, we'll be talking about the Medicaid unwinding, and we'll have Deb Fournier from the UNH Institute of Health Policy and Practice and Jay Couture from the Seacoast Mental Health Center talking about the unwinding of the Medicaid benefits that were frozen in place during COVID and its effects on New Hampshire. And in June, we have Jean from the New Hampshire Fiscal Policy Institute talking about poverty in general, and similar to what we were discussing with the disproportionate impacts on low income and disadvantaged communities that might not be visible at the state level, questions on what we all can do to reduce the poverty that is all around us in New Hampshire, though we have lower rates than the national average, but it's still here and tends to be less visible than it should be. So join us for those. Thank you again, Mary. Real pleasure, and we'll see you next month.